"Ma'am, you need to step down. You're not qualified to testify here." The words didn't echo. They landed flat, like something rehearsed too many times in rooms where people like her were never meant to stand. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't react at all. It just held its breath. From the back row, a boy no older than 12 tightened his grip on the wooden bench, his sneakers barely touching the polished floor, his eyes fixed on the woman in uniform at the center of it all. Ava Brooks didn't move. Not when the attorney's voice cut across the room. Not when a few quiet chuckles slipped from the gallery. Not even when the air shifted. The kind of shift you feel before something breaks, even if nothing has yet. Her military police uniform was pressed sharp, lines clean, brass catching the cold overhead lights. But there was a faint crease near her shoulder, the kind that didn't come from wear, but from standing too long under pressure. She inhaled once, slow, controlled, the way she'd been trained, the way you learn when every reaction is watched twice as closely. "I'm under oath, sir," she said, her voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just present. The attorney, Richard Cole, adjusted his cufflinks with a small, dismissive flick, the kind of gesture that said more than words ever needed to. He smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, but like someone who had never once been told no and expected today would be no different. "And yet," he replied, pacing slowly, each step measured against the hardwood floor, "you expect this court to believe that you, a military officer with no direct jurisdiction here, somehow understand the complexity of this case better than a room full of trained legal professionals?" A few heads nodded. Subtle, automatic. The boy in the back frowned, not fully understanding the words, but understanding the tone. He'd heard that tone before. Ava's fingers tightened for half a second at her sides, then relaxed again. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at the judge. Her gaze moved briefly, just briefly, to the jury, then past them, settling somewhere unseen, like she was anchoring herself to something deeper than the room could touch. "I'm here because I was there," she said quietly. No emphasis, no performance, just truth, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. A soft murmur passed through the courtroom, not agreement. Not yet, but something closer to discomfort. Richard's smile thinned. He hadn't expected that. Not the words, but the way she said them. Calm, unshaken, like she wasn't playing his game at all. The judge shifted slightly in her seat, fingers brushing the edge of the bench, eyes narrowing, not at Ava, but at the space between them. Something was changing. Not loudly, not obviously, but enough. From the back row, the boy leaned forward, elbows on his knees now, eyes locked on Ava as if she were the only thing in the room that made sense. And for the first time since she stepped onto that stand, someone was actually listening. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted in layers, like air slowly returning to a sealed room, one breath at a time, and Ava Brooks stood in the center of it, shoulders squared, chin level, her eyes no longer searching but fixed, steady, anchored somewhere deeper than the polished wood and filtered light that surrounded her. While Richard Cole turned slightly, just enough to glance toward the jury with that same practiced ease, the same controlled confidence that had carried him through dozens of cases before. But there was a flicker now, brief and almost invisible, the kind that only showed when something did not go according to plan, and he covered it quickly, smoothing his tie, exhaling through his nose, as if resetting the room to his rhythm. "You were there," he repeated, slower this time, letting the words stretch, bend, reshape. But being present does not make you credible. And a few people shifted in their seats, not in agreement, but in habit, the kind of reflex that follows authority without question, and the boy in the back felt it. That pull, that pressure, the way a room can lean in one direction even before it decides why. And Ava did not interrupt. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited, letting the words settle, letting them exist without fighting them. And that patience, that refusal to rush, created a space that did not belong to Richard anymore. On the night in question, he continued, stepping closer, not too close, just enough to test the boundary. "You claim you identified a discrepancy in the evidence log, something no one else supposedly noticed." He tilted his head slightly, a gesture almost curious, almost polite, but not quite. "And we are expected to believe that your interpretation is more accurate than the combined analysis of multiple agencies. Ava's hands rested still at her sides, fingers relaxed, no tension, no defensive posture, just stillness, the kind that does not ask for approval. And when she spoke again, her voice was the same as before, measured, calm, grounded. "I am not asking anyone to believe me," she said. And that line did something to the room, subtle but real, like a shift in weight that could not be unseen. "I am stating what I documented." And Richard paused, not because he had to, but because the answer did not give him anything easy to dismantle. It did not argue. It did not challenge. It simply stood, and that made it harder to move around, harder to control. The judge leaned forward slightly now, pen hovering above her notes, not writing, just listening, and one of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing, not at Ava, but at the space between her words, as if trying to see what had been missed before. "Documented," Richard echoed, letting out a small breath that almost resembled a laugh. "By whom?" he asked, and this time there was a sharper edge, less performance, more pressure. "By you." Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." No hesitation, no elaboration, just acknowledgment, and that simplicity forced him to push harder. "And what qualifies you?" he said, voice tightening just slightly, "to make that call in a case of this magnitude?" And the question hung there, heavier now, not just directed at her, but at the entire room, at every assumption sitting quietly beneath the surface. And Ava lifted her eyes, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his gaze fully for the first time. And when she answered, it was not louder, not stronger, but clearer, like something finally coming into focus. "Because I followed the chain of custody step by step," she said, "and I saw where it broke." And the words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed clean, precise, and for a moment, Richard did not move, his jaw tightening just enough to show. And the boy in the back leaned forward even more, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench now, because something was happening, not fast, not loud, but undeniable, like a line being drawn that no one had expected to see. And across the room, someone shifted. Another juror glanced down at the documents in front of them, flipping a page that had already been reviewed, but now carried a different weight. And Ava remained exactly where she was, not advancing, not retreating, just standing, as if the truth itself did not require movement, only presence. And for the first time since the questioning began, the room did not feel controlled. It felt uncertain, like it was waiting, not for permission, but for something real to surface. Richard Cole did not respond right away, and that pause, small as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said so far, because men like him did not pause unless something had shifted beneath their feet, and he knew it, even if he would never show it, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the podium, as if grounding himself back into control. "You saw where it broke," he repeated slowly, his tone softer now, but sharper underneath, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Then explain to this court exactly where that break occurred." And the question was not just a challenge. It was a trap, one designed to pull her into complexity, into over-explanation, into a place where he could twist her words, reshape them, reduce them. But Ava did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit, let the room lean toward her this time. And when she spoke, she did not look at him. She looked at the evidence screen mounted beside the jury, the transfer log from 2,300 hours to 0115 hours. She said, her voice steady, measured, "There is a 17-minute gap where the item was signed out, but not signed back in." And a ripple passed through the courtroom, quiet but real, like a current moving under still water. Richard's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the screen, then back to her, calculating, adjusting. "And you are suggesting," he said carefully, "that this gap indicates tampering." Ava shook her head once, not defensive, not uncertain, just precise. "I am stating that the gap exists," she replied, "and that no official record accounts for it." And that distinction mattered, more than most people in the room realized, because she was not making accusations, she was presenting facts, and facts did not need to argue. They only needed to stand. One of the jurors shifted again, this time leaning forward, pen hovering above his notebook, as if waiting for something to confirm what he was beginning to suspect, and the judge's posture changed subtly, her shoulders straightening, her gaze sharpening, not dismissive anymore, not passive, but engaged, and Richard felt it. The shift, the loss of rhythm. The way the room was no longer moving with him, but around him. 17 minutes, he repeated, a faint smile returning, but thinner now, more forced. In a case that spans months of investigation, and you expect us to believe that this minor inconsistency changes everything. And there it was, the attempt to minimize, to shrink the importance, to reframe the narrative into something manageable, something dismissible. But Ava did not react to the tone. She did not challenge the wording. She simply answered, "It changes enough," she said, and that answer landed differently, not because of volume, but because of certainty, and for a moment, the room seemed to pause again, not frozen this time, but attentive, like it was waiting for the next piece to fall into place. From the back row, the boy's eyes moved from Ava to the screen, then back to Ava, trying to understand, trying to follow, but more than that, trying to hold on to the feeling that something important was happening, something that did not need to be loud to matter, and Richard exhaled. Slowly, turning slightly as if to address the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth again, practiced, controlled. "We must be careful not to let speculation overshadow established facts." But even as he spoke, the words did not carry the same weight, not the same certainty, because the room had already heard something else, something quieter, something harder to dismiss, and Ava stood there, unchanged, her posture steady, her presence unshaken, not trying to win the room, not trying to convince anyone, just holding her ground with a kind of calm that did not come from confidence alone, but from knowing exactly what she had seen, and exactly why it mattered, and somewhere in that stillness, in that refusal to be pulled into noise, the balance of the room continued to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that even Richard Cole, with all his experience, with all his control, could feel it slipping, just slightly, just enough to know that whatever came next would not be as easy as it had been before. Richard Cole let the silence stretch just a second too long, and in that second, something in the room slipped further out of his control, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that the edges of his confidence no longer felt as sharp, and he adjusted his stance, shifting his weight as he turned back toward Ava, his expression composed, but his eyes more focused now, more deliberate. "You keep repeating what you saw," he said, his tone measured, careful. "But this court does not operate on isolated observation. It operates on verified process." And he gestured lightly toward the evidence screen, where the timeline still glowed in clean digital lines, process that has already been reviewed, approved, and entered into record. He paused, letting that settle, letting the authority of it fill the space. "So I will ask you again, Officer Brooks, are you suggesting that multiple departments, multiple trained professionals, all overlooked something that only you managed to catch?" And the question was heavier this time, not just a trap, but a test of credibility, of position, of whether she would step beyond her place and risk being dismissed entirely. And Ava did not move, not even a shift of her shoulders, her hands still at her sides, her posture unchanged. But there was something different now, something quieter but stronger, like a current running beneath still water, and when she answered, her voice carried that same calm, but with a clarity that reached further into the room. "I am saying the record shows a break," she said, "and no one has explained it." And the words did not push, they did not accuse, they simply existed, and that made them harder to dismiss, harder to reshape, because they did not depend on her. They depended on what was already there. And one of the jurors leaned forward again, this time flipping through the printed documents in front of him, slower now, more careful, as if seeing them for the first time, and the judge's pen finally touched paper, not writing quickly, but deliberately, noting something that had not been noted before, and Richard saw it, every small movement, every subtle shift, and for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightened, not in frustration, but in recognition, because the room was no longer following him without question, it was thinking, and thinking was harder to control. "No one has explained it," he repeated, softer now, almost reflective, and then he nodded once, as if conceding the point just enough to redirect it. "Then perhaps there is a reason it does not require explanation," he said. turning slightly toward the judge. Minor administrative inconsistencies happen in large-scale operations. They do not automatically imply significance. And there it was again, the attempt to reduce, to shrink, to reframe the narrative into something manageable, something that could be set aside. But Ava did not react to the shift. She did not follow him into that framing. She remained where she was, steady, grounded, and she spoke again, not louder, not faster, but with the same unwavering precision. 17 minutes is not minor, she said, and that line, simple as it was, landed with a weight that the room could not ignore, because it was not just a statement, it was a boundary, a line drawn clearly, without emotion, without escalation, and for a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the ventilation system faint in the background, the distant sound of footsteps outside the courtroom barely noticeable, and in that quiet, the boy in the back felt something shift again, not in the room this time, but in himself, because he had heard people speak loudly before. He had seen arguments, seen people try to win by force or volume. But this was different. This was someone standing still and somehow moving everything around her, and he did not have the words for it, but he understood it. And at the front of the room, Richard Cole exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing once more against the edge of the podium, grounding himself, recalibrating, because this was no longer a simple dismissal, no longer a routine challenge. This was something that required precision, something that required care, and for the first time since the questioning began, he did not speak immediately. He paused, not out of control, but out of calculation, because he knew that whatever he said next would matter more than anything he had said before. And across from him, Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, not louder, not stronger in appearance, but undeniably present, like a fixed point in a room that was slowly, quietly, beginning to turn around her. Richard Cole finally moved, not forward, not backward, but slightly to the side, as if trying to change the angle of the room itself, his polished shoes making a soft, controlled sound against the hardwood floor, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not louder, not harsher, but more deliberate, like someone choosing each word with care because the margin for error had narrowed. 17 minutes, he said, almost thoughtfully, is still just a number without context, and he turned his gaze briefly toward the jury, then back to Ava. So let us give it context. And there was a subtle tightening in the room, not tension exactly, but anticipation, because this was the moment where control was either regained or lost, and Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she had already accepted whatever direction this would take. During those 17 minutes, Richard continued, was the evidence in your possession? And the question was precise, targeted, designed to narrow the frame, to place her within it, to define her role in a way that could be challenged, and Ava did not hesitate. No, sir, she said, and the clarity of it landed clean, without defense, without hesitation, just fact, and Richard nodded once, a small motion, almost satisfied. So you cannot account for the evidence during that time, he said, pressing gently, not aggressively, but persistently, and Ava met his gaze again, not confrontational, not yielding, just steady. I can account for where it was before, she said, and where it was after. And that answer, simple as it seemed, created a space that did not fully belong to him, because it did not close the gap, it defined it. And one of the jurors stopped flipping pages, his hand resting still on the document, as if the movement itself no longer mattered, and the judge's eyes lifted slightly from her notes, focusing more directly now, and Richard felt it, the shift continuing, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like a current that would not reverse. Before and after, he repeated, his tone measured, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, but not during. And he paused, letting that distinction sit, letting it settle into the room as something that could be interpreted, something that could be questioned, which means your testimony is incomplete, he concluded. And there it was, the attempt to reframe again, to reduce the strength of her position by narrowing its scope, and for a moment, the room seemed to consider it, the idea hanging there, not fully accepted, not fully rejected, just present, and Ava did not rush to respond. She allowed that space to exist, allowed the weight of his words to settle before she spoke, and when she did, her voice remained the same, calm, grounded, unwavering. "The record is incomplete," she said, and that line shifted something again, because she did not defend herself. She redirected the focus back to the evidence, back to what existed independently of her, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to challenge, because it was no longer about her credibility, it was about the gap itself. And a quiet murmur passed through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable, like a ripple that could not be contained. And the boy in the back leaned forward even more, his eyes moving between Ava and the screen, trying to piece together what it all meant, but more than that, feeling the shift in the room, the way authority was no longer absolute, the way something quieter was beginning to take its place. And at the front, Richard Cole's fingers pressed lightly against the podium, not gripping, not tense, but steadying, as if recalibrating once more. Because this was no longer a matter of simply controlling the narrative. It was a matter of navigating something that would not bend easily, something that did not react the way he expected. And for the first time, there was a faint hesitation before he spoke again, not visible to everyone, not obvious, but there, just enough to mark the difference. "Officer Brooks," he said, and his voice was still controlled, still composed, but the edge had softened slightly, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. "Are you aware of any documentation, any report, any witness, that confirms your interpretation of this gap?" And the question hung there, heavier than before, because it was no longer about diminishing her. It was about testing the foundation of what she had presented, and Ava stood as she had from the beginning, unmoved, unshaken, her eyes steady, her voice clear when she answered. "Not yet," she said, and that answer did not weaken the room. It deepened it, because it carried something else with it, something unspoken but present, the sense that what had not yet been seen did not mean it did not exist. And in that quiet, in that stillness, the balance of the room continued to shift, not with noise, not with force, but with something far more difficult to control, the slow, undeniable weight of truth beginning to surface. The words lingered longer than expected, not because they were loud, but because they were unfinished. "Not yet," Ava Brooks had said, and in a room built on certainty, on documented proof and sealed records, those two words should have weakened her position, but they did not. They created something else entirely, a space filled not with doubt, but with anticipation, and Richard Cole felt it immediately. The subtle shift that no amount of practiced composure could fully conceal, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the podium before stilling, his gaze narrowing just slightly as he studied her, recalculating, adjusting, because this was no longer a straightforward dismantling of testimony. This was something more unpredictable, something that required a different kind of control. "Not yet," he repeated, his tone even, but quieter now, less performative, more precise. "So what you are asking this court to consider is the possibility of evidence that has not been verified, not been submitted, and not been reviewed." And he let that settle, not rushing, not pushing, just allowing the weight of procedure to fill the space. And a few heads in the gallery shifted again, not in agreement, but in habit, the reflex of returning to structure when uncertainty appeared. And Ava did not interrupt. She did not correct. She simply listened, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had slowly, quietly reshaped the room. "I am asking the court to acknowledge what is already in the record," she said, and the distinction was subtle, but it landed with precision, because she was not introducing something new. She was pointing back to something that had been overlooked, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to reframe. And one of the jurors exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, as if something had just aligned in his mind. And the judge's pen paused mid-note, her eyes lifting again. Not briefly this time, but fully, her attention no longer divided, and Richard saw it, every small movement, every shift in focus, and for the first time, there was a faint tightening in his expression that he did not immediately smooth away, because the room was no longer responding to him in the way it had at the beginning. It was listening elsewhere. "What is already in the record," he echoed, slower now, as if testing the phrase itself, "is incomplete, as you have stated." And he took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but intentional. And incomplete records do not establish conclusions. And that line, clean and structured, carried the authority of process, of legal expectation, of the rules that governed everything within those walls. And for a moment, it seemed to settle the room again, to pull it back towards something familiar, something defined. But Ava did not move. She did not step into that frame. She remained where she was, and when she answered, her voice did not rise to meet his. It stayed grounded, steady, unwavering. They establish questions, she said. And that line shifted everything again, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because it did not challenge the system. It worked within it. It acknowledged the rules while revealing the space those rules allowed, and the courtroom felt it. The quiet recognition that something had been overlooked not because it was insignificant, but because no one had stopped to ask why it was there. And the boy in the back straightened slightly, his small hands resting flat against the bench now, his eyes fixed on Ava with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with understanding the law and everything to do with recognizing something real, something steady, something that did not bend under pressure. And at the front of the room, Richard Cole exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the evidence screen, then back to Ava, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick redirection, no smooth transition into another line of questioning, just a pause, brief but undeniable, as if the next move required more than instinct, more than routine. And the judge leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying. "Counsel," she said, and that single word brought the room back into alignment. Not with Richard, not with Ava, but with the process itself. And Richard nodded once, acknowledging, recalibrating, his posture straightening as he prepared to continue. But something had already changed, something that could not be undone, because the room was no longer just hearing testimony. It was beginning to question what it had assumed. And in that quiet, in that steady, controlled stillness, Ava Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, not louder, not stronger in appearance, but undeniably present, like a fixed point. That everything else was slowly, quietly beginning to move around. The room did not return to what it had been, even after the judge's voice settled it. Even after the quiet shuffle of papers and the faint clearing of throats, something had already shifted too far beneath the surface, and Richard Cole knew it, not because anyone said it, but because the rhythm he relied on was no longer predictable, no longer obedient. And he adjusted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, his hand resting lightly against the podium as if measuring the weight of the moment before stepping into it. "Officer Brooks," he said, his voice composed, but stripped now of its earlier ease, "you are clearly confident in your observation." And the phrasing was careful, neutral on the surface, but layered underneath. "So let us examine the sequence more precisely." And he turned slightly, gesturing toward the digital timeline once more, its clean lines still glowing under the courtroom lights. "You stated that the evidence was properly logged at 2,300 hours, he continued, his tone methodical, structured. "And then again at 0115 hours. Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." And the acknowledgment was simple, unadorned, and Richard stepped closer to the screen, not too near, just enough to align himself with the visual. "Then during that 17-minute interval," he said, tracing the gap lightly with his finger without touching the surface, "you cannot confirm its location." And again, the narrowing, the attempt to define the limits of her certainty, and Ava's answer came just as steady as before. "I cannot confirm its recorded location," she said, and that single word, recorded, shifted the meaning again, because it introduced a distinction he had not yet controlled. And Richard paused for half a beat, not enough for most to notice, but enough to matter. "Recorded location," he repeated, his eyes sharpening slightly. "So you are suggesting there is a difference between what is recorded and what actually occurred." And now the question was more direct, more pointed, designed to pull her into interpretation, into speculation. But Ava did not step into that space. She remained exactly where she had been, grounded in what she knew. "I am saying the record does not reflect continuous custody," she replied, and the precision of that statement carried its own authority, because it did not accuse, it did not assume, it simply pointed to what was missing, and in that absence, something began to take shape, something the room could feel even if it could not yet define. One of the jurors leaned back slightly now, his pen no longer moving, his eyes fixed on the screen as if the gap itself had become the center of the case, and the judge's expression tightened just slightly, not in disapproval, but in focus, the kind that comes when a detail refuses to be dismissed, and Richard exhaled slowly, his hand dropping from the podium as he turned back toward Ava, and, for the first time, there was no immediate question, no immediate redirection, just a brief stillness as he considered his next move, because the ground had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that every step now required more care, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but more controlled, more exact. "Officer Brooks," he said, "are you implying that this break in record could indicate mishandling?" And the word hung there, heavier than the ones before, because it carried consequence, because it edged closer to something that could not easily be dismissed as minor, and Ava did not rush to answer. She let the word settle, let the weight of it exist before she responded, and when she did, her voice did not rise to meet the implication. It remained steady, grounded, certain. "I am stating that the chain was not continuous," she said, and again, the refusal to overreach, the refusal to claim more than what she could prove, created something. Stronger than accusation, it created credibility, and that credibility was beginning to root itself in the room, quietly, steadily, like something taking hold beneath the surface, and from the back row, the boy shifted again, sitting a little straighter now, his eyes no longer darting between speakers, but fixed on Ava, because he could feel it, even without understanding every word. The way the room was changing, the way certainty was no longer coming from volume or authority, but from something quieter, something steadier, and at the front, Richard Cole held her gaze for a moment longer than before, not challenging, not dismissing, but studying, because whatever he had expected when this questioning began, it was no longer unfolding the way he had planned, and in that quiet, in that measured stillness, the balance of the room continued to tilt. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough that everyone present could feel it, the slow, undeniable shift away from assumption and towards something far more difficult to control, the weight of a question that refused to be ignored. The word chain lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been said, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of what it implied when it was not whole, and for a moment, no one moved, not the jurors, not the judge, not even Richard Cole, whose stillness now felt less like control and more like calculation stretched thin, and he slowly turned his head toward the evidence screen again, as if seeing it differently this time, not as a tool to guide the narrative, but as something that might resist it, not continuous. He repeated under his breath, then louder, enough for the room to follow. "That is your position," and Ava Brooks did not correct him, did not expand. She simply held her ground with a quiet nod, and that restraint, that refusal to say more than necessary, gave her words a weight that filled the space without needing force. And one of the jurors shifted forward again, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, his eyes no longer scanning documents, but fixed entirely on the gap displayed in front of them, as if the absence itself had become evidence, and the judge leaned slightly to the side, her gaze narrowing, her pen resting now instead of moving, and Richard saw all of it, every small adjustment, every shift in attention, and something in his posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that this was no longer routine, no longer predictable. "Let us be precise," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, less performative, more exact. "A break in documentation does not automatically indicate a break in custody," and the line was clean, structured, grounded in process, the kind of statement that usually reset a room, brought it back to familiar ground, and for a moment, it almost did, a few heads in the gallery nodding slightly, the reflex of returning to what was known, what was safe. But Ava did not move. She did not follow him into that framing. She remained exactly where she had been, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had been building, layer by layer, throughout the room. "It means the custody cannot be verified during that time," she said, and the distinction landed with quiet force, because it did not argue against his statement. It completed it in a way that changed its meaning, and that completion shifted the room again, Not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply, like something settling into place that had been waiting all along, and Richard exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly before relaxing again, his fingers brushing once more against the edge of the podium, grounding himself in the physical space as the narrative space became less certain, and he turned back toward Ava, holding her gaze a moment longer this time, not dismissing, not challenging, but measuring. And yet, he said, carefully, no irregularity was reported at the time. And there it was, another angle, another attempt to frame the absence as insignificance, to suggest that if it had mattered, it would have been addressed already, and Ava did not react to the implication. She did not defend. She simply answered, her voice steady, her posture unchanged. No one reported it, she said, but it is there. And that line, simple as it was, carried something heavier than anything before, because it separated awareness from existence, because it suggested that something could be missed, not because it was small, but because no one was looking, and a quiet ripple moved through the courtroom again, softer this time, but more focused, like a collective realization, beginning to form, and the boy in the back felt it without understanding every word, his small hands now resting flat against the bench, his posture straighter, his eyes locked on Ava with a kind of quiet certainty, because what she was doing did not look like winning, it looked like standing, and somehow that was changing everything. And at the front of the room, Richard Cole's composure remained intact, his voice still controlled, his posture still precise, but something beneath it had shifted, something that could not be corrected with phrasing or pacing, because the room was no longer following him out of habit, it was listening with intention, and that made every word heavier, every question riskier, and for the first time since the questioning began, he did not move immediately into his next point. He paused, not out of uncertainty, but because the next step required more than control, it required caution, and across from him, Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniably present, her stillness now the most stable thing in a room that was slowly, quietly, beginning to reconsider everything it thought it already understood. The word there did not fade, it settled, like something placed carefully on a surface that no one had noticed before, and now that it was visible, it could not be unseen, and for a moment, the courtroom felt smaller, not physically, but in focus, as if everything that mattered had narrowed down to a single gap in a timeline, and the woman who refused to let it disappear, and Richard Cole stood very still, his posture still composed, still controlled, but the space around him no longer moved the way it had when this began, and he knew it, not because anyone said it, but because the rhythm had changed, because the room was no longer reacting, it was processing, and that difference was harder to command. It is there, he repeated slowly, his voice quieter now, less certain in its authority, more careful in its direction, but nothing in the record indicates that it affected the integrity of the evidence. And the statement was structured, familiar, grounded in procedure, the kind of line that usually brought things back into alignment. But this time, it did not land the same way, because the room had already begun to ask a different question, not whether something had been proven wrong, but whether something had been overlooked, and Ava Brooks did not interrupt. She did not challenge the structure of his statement. She allowed it to exist. And then, with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning, she spoke. Integrity cannot be confirmed without continuity, she said, and that line shifted the weight again, because it did not argue against him. It completed the logic in a way that changed its direction, and a quiet stillness followed, deeper than before, more focused, as if the room itself had leaned in, and one of the jurors, the man in the gray suit, slowly lowered his pen, not because he had finished writing, but because he no longer needed to, his attention fully fixed now, and the judge's gaze sharpened further, her posture no longer neutral, no longer observational, but engaged, actively considering, and Richard saw it, every small detail, every shift in attention, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no smooth transition into another argument, just a brief pause, controlled but undeniable, and he adjusted his stance again, turning slightly as if to reclaim the space. But the movement felt different now, less like control and more like adaptation. Officer Brooks, he said, and his voice was still steady, still measured, but something in it had changed, something quieter, something that acknowledged, even if only slightly, that this was no longer a simple exchange. Are you aware of any instance where this gap has resulted in a discrepancy in the evidence itself? And the question was precise, narrowing, designed to bring the focus back to outcome rather than process. And Ava did not rush to answer. She let the question settle, let the room feel its weight before she responded, and when she did, her voice remained grounded, unwavering. "No, sir," she said, and, for a moment, it seemed as though the balance might shift back, as though the absence of visible discrepancy might reduce the importance of what she had presented, and a few heads in the gallery moved slightly, the reflex of returning to what could be seen, what could be proven. But Ava did not stop there. She did not let the answer stand alone, and after a brief pause, just long enough for the room to settle into that assumption, she added, "Because no one has examined it under that question." And that second line changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because it introduced something new without introducing anything new at all. It reframed the absence of discrepancy as a lack of inquiry, not a confirmation of integrity, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in pressure that everyone could feel, and the juror in the gray suit leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if recalculating something he had already accepted, and the judge's pen moved again, this time with more purpose, more intent, and Richard Cole's composure held, his posture still precise, his voice still controlled. But there was a moment, brief and almost invisible, where his gaze lingered on Ava just a fraction longer than before, not dismissing, not challenging, but recognizing, because whatever he had expected when this questioning began, it had changed, and the room had changed with it. And from the back row, the boy sat very still now, his hands no longer gripping the bench, his posture no longer shifting, because something had settled in him as well, something quiet and steady, the understanding that what he was witnessing was not loud, not dramatic, but real, and at the center of it all, Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniably present. Her stillness now the clearest thing in a room that was no longer certain of anything except the fact that something important had been missed, and that it was no longer being ignored. The room did not move forward. It held, suspended in that narrow space between what had been accepted and what was now being questioned, and Richard Cole stood at the center of that tension, still composed, still controlled, but no longer unquestioned. His presence now something the room examined rather than followed, and he knew it, not in a way he would ever admit, but in the subtle way his breath slowed, in the way his next words took a fraction longer to form. No one has examined it under that question, he repeated, his voice quieter now, less commanding, more deliberate, as if testing the weight of the statement before deciding how to move around it. And he turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the judge, then back to Ava Brooks, recalibrating, because the path he had been walking no longer led where he expected. And yet, he continued, the absence of such examination does not establish error. And there it was, the attempt to reclaim ground, to redirect the narrative, back toward certainty, back toward the safety of what had not been proven wrong. And for a moment, the room seemed to consider it, the familiar logic settling lightly across the space. But Ava did not move. She did not follow that path. She remained exactly where she had been, grounded in what existed, not in what had been assumed. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness that had begun to reshape the room itself. It establishes a gap in verification, she said, and that distinction, precise and controlled, shifted the meaning once again. Because it did not argue against his statement, it reframed it, turning absence into something active rather than dismissible. And the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in balance that could not be corrected once felt. And the juror in the gray suit leaned forward further, his elbows now resting lightly on the table, his attention no longer divided, no longer passive, and the judge's pen moved again, this time not pausing, not hesitating, but writing with purpose, and Richard saw it. Every small signal, every shift in attention, and for the first time, his composure required effort, not visible effort, not something anyone could point to, but there, beneath the surface, in the slight tightening of his jaw, in the way his fingers pressed more firmly against the edge of the podium before releasing again. Verification, he echoed, his tone measured, but something in it had changed, something less certain, more careful. And you believe this gap undermines the integrity of the evidence. And the question was direct now, no longer circling, no longer framing, but confronting the implication head-on. And Ava did not hesitate. She did not retreat. She did not expand beyond what she could stand on. She simply answered, her voice steady, her posture unchanged. I believe it leaves the integrity unconfirmed, she said, and that line landed with a quiet force that carried further than anything before, because it did not accuse, it did not exaggerate. It simply refused to grant certainty where certainty had not been earned, and the room felt it. The shift from assumption to scrutiny, from acceptance to question, and it was no longer subtle, no longer beneath the surface. It was present, visible in the way the jurors sat, in the way the judge watched, in the way even the gallery had grown still, as if recognizing that something important was unfolding without needing to be announced. And from the back row, the boy leaned forward just slightly, his eyes fixed on Ava, not because he understood every word, but because he understood the feeling, the quiet strength of someone who did not need to raise their voice to be heard. And at the front, Richard Cole stood for a moment without speaking, his gaze resting on Ava longer than before, not dismissing, not challenging, but measuring, because whatever control he had walked into this room with, it no longer moved the way he expected, and in that stillness, in that quiet recalibration, the balance of the courtroom shifted again, not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And for the first time since the questioning began, it was no longer clear who was guiding the room, because the narrative was no longer being controlled. It was being revealed, piece by piece, through the steady, unwavering presence of someone who refused to let what was missing remain unseen. The room had crossed a line no one had announced, a quiet threshold where certainty no longer belonged to authority alone, and Richard Cole stood at its edge, still composed, still upright, but no longer untouched by what had unfolded. And for the first time, the space around him did not bend automatically to his presence. It waited, it measured, it questioned, and he felt it in the way his next breath came slower, more deliberate, as if even that required intention now. Unconfirmed, he repeated, his voice controlled but softer, less anchored in dominance and more in precision. So what you are presenting to this court is not evidence of failure, but the absence of confirmation. And the phrasing was careful, almost neutral, an attempt to regain ground without overreaching. And for a moment, it hovered there, balanced, as if the room might return to something familiar, something defined. But Ava Brooks did not move. She did not follow the framing. She remained exactly where she had been, steady, grounded, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet clarity that had slowly, relentlessly shifted the room. I am presenting what the record shows, she said, and the simplicity of it removed the need for interpretation, removed the space where doubt could be reshaped into dismissal, and that simplicity landed with weight, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. And one of the jurors exhaled softly, the sound barely audible but present, like something settling into place, and the judge leaned forward slightly more, her eyes fixed now, fully engaged, not observing, but evaluating, and Richard saw it, every subtle shift, every movement that signaled the room was no longer his to guide. And for a moment, he did not speak, not out of uncertainty, but because the next move required more than strategy. It required restraint, and that was not something he had needed before. The record, he said finally, his voice steady but quieter, was reviewed by multiple agencies before entering this courtroom, and the statement carried weight, the authority of process, of validation, of everything that should have secured the ground beneath him, and none of them raised this concern. And there it was, the return to consensus, to collective verification, the idea that what had not been questioned before should not be questioned now, and the room felt it, the pull of that logic, the comfort of established agreement. And for a brief moment, it seemed to settle again, but Ava did not move. She did not retreat into that comfort. She remained where she was, and when she answered, her voice did not challenge, did not confront. It simply clarified. They did not raise it, she said. But it is still there. And the repetition did not weaken the point. It reinforced it, grounding it further, anchoring it deeper, and the effect was subtle but undeniable. Because it separated awareness from reality once more, because it reminded the room that something could exist without being acknowledged, and that acknowledgment was not what made it real. And the juror in the gray suit shifted again, this time sitting back slightly, his expression more focused, more intent, as if recalibrating everything he had assumed before, and the judge's pen moved again, slower now, more deliberate, as if each word carried more weight than the last, and Richard Cole stood very still, his gaze fixed on Ava, and for the first time, there was no immediate counter, no immediate redirection. Just a pause, brief but clear, where calculation gave way to recognition, not of defeat, not yet, but of change, because the room had moved, and it had not moved with him. And from the back row, the boy watched in silence, his small frame still, his eyes steady, because something in the air had shifted in a way he could feel even without understanding every word. The way a room changes when truth begins to surface, not all at once, not loudly, but steadily. And at the center of it all, Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her voice calm, her presence unwavering, not trying to win, not trying to dominate, but simply refusing to let what was missing remain unseen. And in that refusal, in that quiet, controlled stillness, the balance of the courtroom continued to tilt, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that everyone present could feel it, the slow, undeniable shift away from assumption and toward something far more difficult to ignore, the weight of truth that no longer needed to be proven to be felt. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt deliberate, like the room itself had chosen to stop and listen. And in that stillness, something subtle but irreversible took hold, not in the documents, not on the screen, but in the way people were now watching, the way they were no longer waiting for direction but forming their own. And Richard Cole stood at the center of that shift, his posture still upright, his voice still measured, but the certainty that once carried him had thinned into something more careful, more restrained. It is still there, he repeated quietly, as if the words themselves had weight he could not ignore, and for a moment, he did not move, did not speak further, just stood with the realization settling around him, not as defeat, not yet, but as recognition, because the room had changed in a way that could not be undone. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not weaker, but more precise, more aware of its limits. "Officer Brooks," he said, "you have made it clear that there is a gap in documentation, and that this gap has not been addressed." And he paused, not to control the room, but to acknowledge it. However, the responsibility of this court is to determine whether that gap has material impact. And there it was, a shift in framing, not dismissing, not minimizing, but narrowing, focusing the question into something that could be resolved, something that could be decided, and the room leaned into that distinction, the jurors sitting slightly straighter, the judge's gaze sharpening further, and Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been, her posture steady, her presence grounded, and when she answered, her voice did not rise, did not push, it simply aligned with what had been asked. "That is for the court to decide," she said, and the response did not retreat, it clarified, placing the responsibility exactly where it belonged, not on her, not on assumption, but on the process itself, and that clarity shifted the room again, not away from her, but toward the weight of the question itself, and the judge leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the bench now, her voice calm but carrying. "Officer Brooks," she said, "are you prepared to submit your findings regarding this gap for further review?" And Ava did not hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, and the answer was simple, direct, without embellishment, and yet it carried something more, the quiet certainty of someone who had already done the work, who had already seen what needed to be seen. And the judge nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried significance. "The court will accept the request for review," she said, and with that, something shifted fully, not in noise, not in reaction, but in direction, because what had been dismissed as minor, as insignificant, was now being acknowledged, formally, officially, and the room felt it, the change in gravity, the movement from assumption into action, and Richard Cole stood very still, his gaze fixed forward, his expression controlled. But beneath that control, something had settled, something that could not be undone, because the narrative had moved beyond his control, beyond his ability to shape it entirely. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because the space no longer belonged to him in the same way. And from the back row, the boy sat quietly, his small frame still, his eyes steady, because something had resolved inside him as well, something simple but clear, that what mattered did not always arrive loudly, did not always force its way into the room. Sometimes it stood quietly, waited patiently, and refused to move until it was seen. And at the center of it all, Ava Brooks remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniably present, her stillness now the most stable thing in a room that had finally begun to move, not away from her, but toward the truth she had quietly, steadily refused to let disappear. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not shift in any dramatic way after the judge's words settled into the air, but something deeper than movement had already taken place, something quieter, something that did not need acknowledgment to be real. And as the sound of the gavel marked the transition to the next phase, people began to move again, papers gathered, chairs adjusted, low voices returning in careful tones. But the atmosphere was no longer the same. It carried a different weight now, not tension, not uncertainty, but recognition, and Ava Brooks stepped down from the stand with the same measured control she had carried throughout, her boots making soft, even contact with the floor, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not relieved, not triumphant, just steady, as if nothing about her had shifted even though everything around her had. And she did not look toward the gallery, did not seek reaction, did not wait for acknowledgment. She simply moved forward, one step at a time, grounded in something that did not depend on the room's approval. And as she passed the defense table, Richard Cole remained standing, his hand resting lightly against the surface, his gaze forward, but not fixed, not distant, something in it quieter now, less certain, and for a brief moment, just a moment, his eyes shifted toward her, not with challenge, not with dismissal, but with something harder to define, something closer to recognition, because whatever he had expected when he first addressed her, whatever assumptions had guided his words, they no longer held in the same way. And Ava did not stop, did not acknowledge the glance. She continued past him with the same quiet composure, not because she had not noticed, but because she did not need to respond. And that choice, that absence of reaction, carried more weight than anything she could have said. And in the back row, the boy remained seated, his small frame still, his eyes following her as she walked, and for the first time since he had entered that room, he did not feel like he was watching something he did not understand. He felt like he had witnessed something he would remember, something that did not need explanation to make sense. And as Ava reached the aisle, she paused for just a fraction of a second. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for the moment to exist, and she adjusted the cuff of her uniform, a small, precise motion, the fabric catching the light briefly before settling again. And then she continued forward, disappearing into the quiet movement of the hallway beyond, and behind her, the courtroom resumed its rhythm. But it was not the same rhythm, not the same unquestioned flow. It carried something new, something that had been placed there without force, without noise, something that would remain long after the session ended. And at the front of the room, Richard Cole slowly straightened, his hand lifting from the table, his posture returning to its familiar precision. But the space around him no longer responded in the same way, because the room had seen something different, something that did not align with the narrative he had tried to shape, and that difference could not be undone. And the judge glanced once more at her notes before closing the folder in front of her, her expression composed, but thoughtful, as if the proceedings had left something unresolved in a way that required more than routine to address. And as people began to file out, voices low, measured, carrying fragments of what had been said, the boy finally stood, his sneakers brushing lightly against the floor as he turned toward the exit. But before he left, he looked once more toward the empty space where Ava had stood, and for a moment, he remained there, still, as if holding onto something that did not belong to the room anymore. And then he walked out into the light beyond the doors, and the courtroom, now quieter, now settled, remained behind, holding the echo of something that had never needed to be loud to change everything. Because in the end, she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not fight for control of the room. She simply refused to ignore what was there, and in doing so, she changed not just the course of a case, but the way the room itself understood what truth could look like, not forceful, not dramatic, but steady, present, and impossible to overlook.